The San Andrés Islands are often seen as extensions of Colombia, tropical outposts tied by history, language and law. But what if the island's earliest inhabitants came from somewhere entirely different? What if ancient DNA, buried beneath shell middens and coral sands, reveals a story not of Colombian settlers, but of voyagers from the Caribbean or even Central America? Before we start, I'm on a road to get 1,000 subscribers as a small channel. If you want to help me, please subscribe. This is the story of how one small island's genetic legacy is challenging everything we thought we knew about its human past. San Andrés lies deep in the Caribbean Sea, over 700 kilometers northwest of mainland Colombia and closer to the coasts of Nicaragua and Honduras. Though politically Colombian today, its location places it at a maritime crossroads between Central America, South America and the Antilles. For decades, historians assumed the island's first settlers were fisher farmers from Colombia's Caribbean coast or the Miskito people of Nicaragua. This idea made sense. San Andrés lacks rivers, large mammals or fertile land, making it seem unsuitable for long-term habitation. Early maps don't show much activity before the 16th century, and the Spanish claimed it was uninhabited until European colonization. But this assumption began to fray as archaeologists uncovered shell middens, hearth sites and stone tools, suggesting a human presence centuries before the first recorded colonial settlers. If the first inhabitants weren't Colombian, who were they? Ancient DNA might be the only tool sharp enough to slice through the mystery. Studying ancient DNA in tropical islands like San Andrés is a race against time. The island's heat, humidity and salty air degrade bones quickly, and acidic soils make preservation even harder. For decades, archaeologists assumed DNA wouldn't survive here, but technology has caught up. Scientists now use a method called hybridization capture, which allows them to extract even fragmented genetic material from dense petrous bones and ancient teeth. These samples are then sequenced at key points, single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs that can reveal a person's ancestry. In recent digs on San Andrés, researchers recovered usable DNA from several skeletal fragments found in cave shelters and coastal middens. Though partial, the sequences were good enough to run principal components analysis, comparing them to known genomes from the Americas and beyond. What they found didn't match expectations. Instead of a neat tie to Colombian populations, the DNA pulled San Andrés into a much wider genetic conversation, one that spans the Caribbean and beyond. Archaeologists working on San Andrés have long debated when the island was first inhabited. While colonial records say the island was unoccupied before the 1600s, excavations in coastal caves and upland rock shelters suggest otherwise. Researchers found shell middens, charcoal-rich hearths, and primitive tools fashioned from coral and basalt. Some of these sites have radiocarbon dates going back 1,000 to 1,500 years, predating European contact by centuries. Curiously, pottery fragments found at several sites resemble styles from mainland Colombia, but others match Caribbean ceramics more closely. Even more puzzling are signs of trade. Obsidian flakes, carved beads and seeds from non-native plants, hinting at long-distance contact. Still, none of these discoveries definitively pointed to a specific culture or migration route. Without written records and with much of the archaeological material eroded or buried under development, researchers turned to ancient DNA to settle the debate. And what they found is reshaping how we think about this island's ancient visitors. When researchers analyzed the ancient DNA from San Andrés, the results were surprising. Instead of clustering neatly with indigenous groups from coastal Colombia, several individuals showed stronger genetic affinities to Caribbean islanders, particularly ceramic-age populations from the Greater Antilles. Using principal components analysis, scientists found that some San Andrés individuals mapped closer to people from Cuba and Hispaniola than to mainland South American groups. Even more unexpected were genetic links to Central America, especially regions along the Nicaraguan and Honduran coasts, suggesting that seafaring communities may have reached San Andrés from multiple directions. These lineages had little to no overlap with the DNA of early Colombian agriculturalists, challenging the long-held assumption that the island was simply a cultural offshoot of the continent. Instead, San Andrés appears to have been a point of convergence, a place touched by both Caribbean and Mesoamerican maritime travelers who left behind not just tools, but traces of their ancestry in the bones. The DNA patterns from San Andrés suggest not a single colonization event but multiple waves of arrival across centuries. The first group likely arrived between 2000 and 1,500 years ago. These individuals carried genetic markers found in coastal Central American and Caribbean archaic populations, people who were skilled at navigating open water in dugout canoes, following seasonal fish migrations, and relying on shellfish, turtles, and seabirds. Then, around 800 to 500 years ago, a second wave appeared. These newcomers had clear ties to mainland Colombia and Nicaragua, particularly the Mosquito and Afro-Caribbean coastal communities. They brought different pottery styles, practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, and may have displaced or absorbed earlier groups. The two populations remained largely distinct in the DNA record, suggesting they lived in parallel rather than blending fully. Together, they transformed San Andrés into a layered human landscape, one that reflected both early seafaring resilience and later mainland expansion, long before colonial powers arrived. Despite living on a small island, the two groups that arrived on San Andrés appear to have maintained distinct identities. Genetic data shows minimal admixture between the earlier archaic-related seafarers and the later mainland farmer fishers. This suggests cultural boundaries, perhaps differences in language, belief systems, or settlement patterns that kept the groups apart. Archaeological layers support this idea. Older sites are concentrated near cliffs and caves, while newer ones are closer to fertile inland clearings. Though they may have interacted, the two populations likely saw themselves as different peoples. The island, rather than blending them, preserved their separation for generations. The maternal and paternal genetic markers add even more depth to the story. The earliest individuals on San Andrés carried mitochondrial haplogroups like C1d and D1, often found in ancient Caribbean and Central American populations, evidence of early female migration via sea routes. Later arrivals brought haplogroups like B2A, more typical of mainland South American farmers. On the Y-DNA side, earlier samples showed a rare Q1 lineage linked to archaic foragers, while later samples revealed more common QM3 markers associated with Andean and northern Colombian populations. These patterns confirmed two genetically and culturally distinct waves of settlement, each leaving a separate signature in the island's population history. For too long, the story of San Andrés began with colonial records and overlooked anything that came before. But ancient DNA now forces a complete rethinking of the island's past. Rather than a simple extension of mainland Colombia, San Andrés emerges as a maritime frontier shaped by multiple seafaring worlds. Its earliest inhabitants weren't inland farmers or Spanish settlers. They were ocean travelers, likely from the Caribbean and Central America, who reached the island using knowledge of currents, stars, and survival at sea. Later groups from the mainland brought new tools and farming practices, but they didn't erase what came before. Instead, the island became a layered cultural space where different groups lived side by side, sometimes trading, sometimes avoiding one another, but always leaving their mark. San Andrés was never just a colonial footnote. It was an active hub in the ancient Caribbean, and its genetic legacy reveals a deeper, older chapter we're only beginning to understand. There's still much we don't know about the earliest people of San Andrés. Most ancient DNA comes from just a few cave sites, and many older layers may lie buried beneath vegetation or eroded into the sea. Could underwater archaeology reveal even older remains or seasonal camps now submerged? What role did San Andrés play in the broader Caribbean trading networks? Did early islanders influence or exchange with populations from Jamaica, Honduras, or even Panama? As new excavations and DNA comparisons continue, the answers may shift again. One thing's clear, the island's ancient past is far richer than anyone imagined. San Andrés is more than a tropical paradise, it's a genetic time capsule. Ancient DNA reveals that long before the age of maps and flags, people from distant shores landed here, adapted, and left their mark in bone and blood. The island's first inhabitants weren't who we thought. They were voyagers, fishermen, and navigators from across the Caribbean and Central America. Their story challenges our maps and deepens our sense of connection across the sea. What other surprises might small islands like this be hiding? Let me know in the comments. Like, share and subscribe for more ancient journeys, and check out the Patreon to support the next dive into history.